Yo, what up? It's your boy Vuxco, and I'm going to be here to tell you about the CS economy and try and make it as simple as possible so that you can really understand exactly how you should be using your money and when, and how you can try and track your opponent's economy. I'll try and give you a shortcut to really getting an idea of what your opponent's economy is and how you can use that to your own benefit. And I'll be doing so by watching a game and going over the players' mistakes in the game to give you a real idea of what this looks like in a very real scenario. Before we go any further, I want to thank the sponsor for this video, Leadify. Leadify is an AI coach that allows you to improve faster by analyzing your Faceit or matchmaking games and giving you insight into your weaknesses as well as personalized training. Leadify has also implemented a team finder area on their website that will match you based on your skill level, schedule, and ambition so you can find like-minded players outside of my YouTube comments. Whether you're a beginner, intermediate, advanced, or you're a professional player watching my videos trying to be as good as me, Leadify is the app for you. It's also free to use, so give a click to the link in the description and head on over to leadify.com. So we've got this player here, McCanny, who says he's DMG and he's also Faceit 5 or 6, and he wants to know about some stuff totally unrelated to the economy, but we're here to talk about the economy because I think this is a very important game to take a look at. Now, the first thing I want to talk about that you should pay attention to throughout this review is the numbers 4K and 2K. Above 4,000, you're almost certainly going to be going for a buy the vast majority of the time. Below 2K, you're also going to be going for a force buy the majority of the time because one save is unlikely to allow you to go for a buy in the following round. And the other thing you want to keep in mind is roughly 3,300 to 4K is the gray area that we're really going to be paying attention to where it varies, and that's where things get very interesting. Especially with the new economy, some things have changed, but that's a pretty complex idea, so we'll bring that up a little bit later. First off, I want to talk about the more simple ideas, which include pistol round and making sure that for the love of God, please buy on pistol round. So to look at something more specific, we'll go into the second round here outside of pistol and look at the buy they have now. So the CTs do lose this pistol, and the most common thing on the CT side is to buy on second round. The reason for that is you can definitely break the T side economy, and you're not going to have a ton of money heading into round 3 to go for a good buy regardless. You're going to have, 4,300 or so if you full save, but there is a very important concept to keep in mind that full saves are not something you necessarily want to be going for very often because they allow that T side to build up a ton of economy of their own. So usually you're going to want to see a force on second rounds. Dust 2 CT side is a map where sometimes it kind of feels like that force on second round isn't that likely to win because the angles are so long range. However, you also have to keep in mind that the third round buy isn't that great for the CTs either because you can't have any ops and you can't have full utility or you can't have good rifles on a map that, does require that type of thing. So usually a force on second round will make a lot of sense, and unfortunately the CTs don't go for that on this round. They go for a save, and it doesn't work out very well for them even though they actually stack the correct bomb site. So they go for that save. We head into round number 3, and this is where I'll bring up the economy a little bit in terms of what matters for your opponents. You see the T's here have 4 players left alive, and that's what's often going to happen if you go for those nearly full saves with just USPs. And that T side is gaining a ton of money when they win with 4 or 5 players alive, especially as the T's had 4 SMGs in the previous round. They're going to be able to go for a bonus round here, which means even if they lose it, they're very likely to go for a buy in the following round. And that's something to keep in mind. Look at how many players died on that second round. If enough players died, they're going to be broke if they lose the round. But if enough players survive, and that's more likely going to be 4 or 5 for both sides, that bonus round is something that can come up. The CT side here, because of what happened last round, they're going to have to go for a buy. Of course, they did save, but you can see the buy here. And this is where I talked about how you should be spending your money, because that's important as well. You have 4 players here with no utility. and one guy's going to buy a scout and get a little bit of utility for himself. Usually you want to make sure you have a bit of a balance. You want to make sure that you have a couple of people with rifles and not much utility, and a few people with SMGs as well. There are other maps where you can be more heavy on the SMGs, for example, a map like Inferno or a map like Nuke. On Nuke, you might want your outer player to have something like an AUG and maybe low utility, but you'd want your upper players to have heavy utility. On a map like Dust 2, you could probably go for something like 2 M4s and 2 SMGs or FAMASs. The map is a bit complex because the ranges are very long, which means you really do want those rifles. However, you absolutely need some utility or you're simply not going to be able to win this type of round. And unfortunately, this player here, he even goes for a scout, and instead of buying utility, he buys a deagle. So you have 2 pieces of utility for the entire CT team. Buying head armor here is something I do fully support. Usually later in the half, you want to be saving that money and buying body armor a lot of the time if you're in bad economic scenarios. But round 3, unless you know they don't have SMGs, for example, they had 5 rifles and they all survived. With the fact that they had 4 alive and at least 3 SMGs, head armor here makes sense. But it would make a lot more sense for a player or two to have at least a FAMAS with utility and head armor, or an MP9, and you play up on Cat or B, something like that, rather than all rifles. Now we're going to skip round number 4 because it's not that interesting. Both teams had plenty of enough money to buy. Into round number 5 here, where there is a bit of a question as to what buy the T's could be going for. Now the reason there's a bit of a question isn't because the T's had a ton of money. You can actually see that they had one player with roughly about 5,300. This player here, Cry Red Dragon, had probably about 4,500. Then you've got 2,750, 3,150, and 3,850. And if you remember back to the start, I said above 4K is a scenario where you're almost certainly going to be buying if your whole team has that. And here we don't have a full team with above 4K. But you need to be thinking about your opponent's economy, especially when you're on the T side. The CT side, usually the general rule is to focus on your own economy and only worry about yourself for the most part, except for very specific scenarios. On the T side, playing with your opponent's economy is very good because your opponents have a much more fragile economy that you can actually play with, and you're much more able to go for reasonable force buys. Now, in this scenario, the CTs had 4 alive and then 2 alive with a bomb defusal, and that means they're not going to have a ton of money. The way you can look at it is generally 3 players alive is about the baseline. On CT side, you have 3 players alive, you lose maybe a little bit, you're about break even. 4 alive, you're going to gain a decent amount, and 5 alive, you're going to gain quite a bit. Whereas if you have 2 alive, you're going to lose a good amount, and if you have 1 alive, your economy is essentially in shambles. However, on the T side, 3 alive is roughly break even. You're probably going to gain a little bit. 4 alive, you're going to gain a good amount, and 5, you're going to be gaining bucket loads, whereas 2 alive, you're going to be losing quite a bit, and 1 alive, you're going to be losing a lot, really. But it's just not quite as much as those CTs. You can still, though, keep a general rule in mind that above and below 3 is the number you're usually going to want to be looking at. So if your opponents had, 4 players alive one round and 2 players alive another, you can somewhat average that out at about 3 players, and that means their economy really didn't grow very much at all over those rounds. And for that reason, the T's are likely going to want to go for a force here, even though they don't have a ton of money, because they know that if they win this round, they can break the economy of the CTs. That really makes the T side economy effective because you can break that economy of the CTs and force them onto ecos with it winning less gun rounds than the CTs are actually winning. Now, you can see on the CT side, they've got 1 player with enough to maybe drop in the following round and 1 player that can buy himself, which means if they were to lose this, they would have 3 players able to go for a buy. But that's 2 players short of what they need, and it does get a little bit finicky here because they shouldn't even have this much money in the bank. Their buy here is not correct. This player, McCanny, should be dropping a gun for his teammates so that they can get utility, because you have 2 players now with M4s no utility. So they should actually have a little bit less money than they have here, and their buy in this round, because they have saved a bit of money, is actually quite weak, and it means the T's have an even better chance of winning the round right now. You've got 4 kits here on the CTs. Typically, if your economy is somewhat low, you don't need 4 kits. Usually you maybe need 2 or 3. Unless you have tons of money, then you may as well get 5. And the most common way to get those kits into the right hands is to have them on your rotators. Usually if you have it on like your elevator CT player and you have it on maybe your mid player, the way you play it is if they die, it's usually going to be easy to pick up that kit off their dead body. And if they survive, they're going to be in the retake in order to be able to go for a defuse later in the round. If you have it on a site anchor, maybe he dies back plat on B, it's going to be a little bit more awkward to try and retrieve that as opposed to a rotator. But usually you can just take a look at it and see, well, we've got 3 kits and I don't have a ton of money, and this hider player should clearly have not purchased a kit and he should have asked for a draw. So now the CTs are back onto very low money, unfortunately for them, and the T's won that round with 4 players alive. Now, if the T's had won that with 0 or 1 player alive, that would have been, really great for the CTs in terms of their ability to win this round and hurt the economy of the T's. But as I said, you want to focus mostly on your own economy. And in this scenario with the CTs, because you have 3 players below 2K, you probably need to go for a force. Now, you do have 1 player with 7850, and sometimes you can balance that out. If he's got 10K and you have 2 players below 2K, then he can drop a couple players in the following round and you can go for a bit of a save. But unless he's got enough that in the next round with a 1900 loss bonus, he's going to be able to drop 2 players, this isn't really going to work out as a save, so they really should be going for a buy here. Again, under 2K, you're almost certainly going for a buy unless your loss bonus is quite high and, maybe you have like a 2900 loss bonus, but if that were the case, you wouldn't have under 2K to begin with because you would have started the round with 2400. So the CTs should be going for a buy here, but they're not. And this is where economies start to get really shattered, because if you look into the following round, things are going to go very wrong. So you head into round number 7, and now you've got a scenario where players thought they could save and buy the next round, but they couldn't. And so you've got 3 players that clearly cannot buy here and 2 players that clearly can. With 4 players left alive twice in a row, you can see the T's have built up a very solid economy already, and there's not much danger of them saving if they lose 1 round. So what you want to be doing on the CT side is just get yourself a good buy so you can get your feet beneath you to try to win some rounds. And that means you don't buy here. However, you've got a couple players with enough money, and because they didn't think about their team's economy, you can see Kryn bought, then Bruin bought, and they've now really put themselves in a scenario where they're going to have a bad buy for the remainder of the majority of the half. Because you've got a couple of players that don't have enough to buy. So this hider guy is going to be saving. You've got, you've got an op with no armor here. You've got no smoke for the cross because the B player needs to keep his smoke to use on B. You've really put your economy in a terrible spot because of that previous round where nobody told their team, guys, we have to force here. So luckily for the CTs, they did actually win that round, and that has righted the sinking ship of their economy. However, they also have the bonus of the fact that if you win an eco or a half buy, you are going to have lots of extra money. And it doesn't look like they have lots of extra money, but they do have much more than they would otherwise because Hyder saved last round and he could have afforded to buy this round regardless, which means he's got extra money in the bank that he can use on an op. The problem in this round, though, is that you have 5 players with head armor. You don't need 5 players with head armor this late into the half. The problem with the buy here is that they're not keeping in mind the T economy. At the moment, the T's had 4 alive twice in a row and then they lost. And for the Ts, that's generally going to be a pretty comfortable buy. For the CT side, it becomes more of a bit of a question mark if that was to happen in the other direction. However, in this scenario, you don't need 5 head armors because the Ts should definitely be buying here. Now, when I say for the CTs is a little bit more of a question mark, you want to play that little game where basically what you do is you do the above and below 3 thing. If you have more than 3 players alive twice in a row, you're probably going for a buy. If you have, less than 3 twice in a row, you're probably going for a save, something like that. Now, with the CT side being more of a question mark, it does rely on how long did the round go, how much utility did they use. If the round went really fast and they lost, you just rush B and you die immediately, then your CTs are probably going to have a buy up because they didn't have to rebuy 1,500 worth of utility twice. That's a lot of utility. However, if you slowed the round down, and this is why you're going to see pro teams slow rounds down all the time, your opponents are forced to waste a lot of utility, and that means they're going to have to rebuy all of it, and that can actually seriously impact the buy up they have in the following rounds. So this round isn't that interesting for the buy, just the CTs made a clear mistake getting too much head armor, and unfortunately they made another mistake losing the round. And now the CTs again have 2 players under 2k, which means this should clearly be a force buy. And again, they don't go for a force. I think the biggest problem that is very often the case when it comes to buys like this is CTs typically don't know when they should be going for a force. However, in my experience, if you just tell your team that they need to be forcing in a scenario and then do it yourself, you're typically going to have pretty good results. So now again, similar to a few rounds back, because they went for a save when they didn't have enough money to buy off of a save, they are going to have a really discoordinated buy where you've got no utility, you've got a P90, it's just really not a great buy, and it's just not something that you can be very comfortable with. Now I want to switch sides here and look at a sequence of rounds that really show you why on T side you do actually focus on your opponent's economy a bit, and on the CT side you usually focus on yourself. So we'll look at this round here where the CTs go for a buy and the Ts go for a buy as well. Nothing too crazy about this situation, although the CT buy isn't perfect, but if we look into the next round, then you're going to see something notable. So the CTs lost 2 players there, and the Ts, they do have a bit of money to work with, but not a ton. Now, they do have 4 of 5 players over 4,500, which should be a fairly comfortable buy for themselves. As long as, only 1 player is going for a weak buy and 4 players are going for a pretty strong buy, you can really comfortably go for a buy on the T side at least. Whereas alternatively, if 1 player is going for a very weak buy with 2,800 and the others have just barely a buy like 3,700 or 4,000, then you might consider it a little bit more. Anyways, they'll go for the buy here, and this isn't the greatest buy of all time. The CTs still have a decent amount of money as they had 3 players left alive, so they're not too uncomfortable. They just didn't have full utility. But the CTs will win this round as well, and then you go into the following round here where this is more of a question mark of a buy. You do have the CTs that lost 3 players and then 2 players, and if it had been 1 less player on either round, that is a clear force for the Ts because your opponent's economy is so hurt. Again, you do the over under 3 calculation. You had 3 one round, which is break even. You had 2 the next, which is losing a little bit, which means they're probably not going to be able to afford a rebuy if they lose this round. Now, if it had been 2 and 2 or 3 and 1, then the CTs would be incredibly broke and you would be able to fight against a very weak CT side buy with a relatively okay T side buy. Again, it wouldn't be great, but when you know your opponents are going to be able to afford M4s and ops, those pistol forces that you can go for on 2nd and 3rd round against some SMGs and usually no op become much less effective. And here you can see that the CTs, they do have to buy pretty much all the way down, and they have, similar to in the first half, they have a couple of players that probably should have just been dropped because they can't afford utility. They do have a reasonable buy here, and I don't think this is a scenario where you would usually go for a force. However, it's not the end of the world to go for a force, especially if you have this type of spawn where you can go for a straight up play. You know, you have this really nice B spawn, you can go for a B rush where you can utilize close range weaponry and actually get the fullest extent out of it. So it's not the end of the world, but probably not a scenario where you want to go for a buy unless you have over 3k on your players. Instead, they had roughly 2,500 on the majority of players, which means there's no rifles, and with no rifles, you're typically not going to beat a bad CT rifle buy that effectively. The thing is, what happens here is they don't win that round, they get 4 kills, and they get a bomb plant. And now, because of the way the T-side economy works, they've built up to nearly a comfortable buy, while the CTs have continued to lose money. So if you look at this buy from the CTs now, they don't even have a full buy, and the Ts have 4 rifles and a scout. And this is, again, why the Ts focus more on the CT economy than the other way around. Because if you can force bomb plants and you can force your opponents to continue losing players, you're going to eventually get to a point where you can break their economy with a good buy that, you know, literally a better buy than the CTs have over that time period. Eventually, this type of thing is possible, and that's again why you have these scenarios where the Ts will go force after force if they keep getting good amounts of kills. It's really coming down to the price of the CT equipment and the fact that the Ts can get bomb plants, as well as the fact that they can choose their place of attack. They can go together and they can utilize less utility overall to get good work done, whereas the CTs, they respond, which means they need more full sets of utility to get their job done. So the Ts do in fact win this round, and the CTs have a terrible economy, but hopefully this gave you a better idea of the way the economy works in CS. Hopefully it allowed you to understand the gray area buys a little bit better, and I hope I gave you some instruments that can allow you to actually evaluate whether or not you should be buying with consistency. So thanks for watching, and I hope this helped.